when you're walking with Jesus, it should be lighter. He's caring, he's promised to transform you. And our job is to open and allow it.
What is up? This is the Nook Podcast. My name is Steven, and I am delighted that you chose to hang out with me for a while today. Jesus will always be at the center of this podcast, and my constant prayer is that no matter what you think about him, the discussions here will bring you closer to who he is. If you ever have any questions or comments, you can reach me directly. The email address is steven@nookpodcast.com. That address is always in the show notes, along with links to the Nook Facebook page, my social media feeds, and one that just says support the show, which is a safe and simple way for you to help pay some of the bills we incur here. When I land on a topic that I want to do a series of shows about, I always endeavor to come at said topic from a few different angles so that each episode might stir our minds and hearts to consider different aspects of that topic. So for a topic such as worshiping God, I could just line up a handful of worship leaders and pastors and everything would kind of sound the same. I hope that this show is never that predictable. In this episode, I want to dive into the side of things that may hinder us from worshiping God in fullness. In John 4:24, Jesus said that the Father is seeking those who would worship him in spirit and in truth. That's the core scripture for this series. And the more that I have thought about this, it really seems like a tall order. If I am to worship God that way, I need to be able to shake off the things that keep me from getting there. Allow me to introduce you to Kelley Fabian. At the end of last year, I was reading her latest book, Holy Vulnerability: Spiritual Practices for the Broken, Ashamed, Anxious, and Afraid. And as I was planning this series, it occurred to me that so much of what she wrote was taking on the very things that can keep so many of us from having those deep connections with God that we desperately need.
I grew up in the city of Chicago in a high-rise, so it was an interesting way to grow up as a kid back then. That's very common now, but it's less common. It was less common then, and it kind of shaped my sensibilities and that sort of thing. It was very secular. We didn't go to church, but we did attend a Catholic school. So there was something going on there, and I always sort of felt some connection to something, and it was God. I didn't know who that was exactly. But for the most part, I kind of went about trying to get a good job and have a family, just, the sorts of things that you do. But without much of a faith background or influence, other than the influence being at a Catholic school was having. And then I went to law school and I got married. And long story short, I became a Christian in a very sort of unexplainable, surprising kind of way when I was 33. So in 2008, I had been practicing law for about 8 years at that point, and God just came and, as I look back, I realized it was an answer to prayer, but came and got me. That's the best way I can say it. He came and got me.
I love stories like that, especially when it just doesn't seem, when it seems like you were on a certain path, like you just said, and all of a sudden there's this beautiful interruption in the story.
Yes.
How did it jank from there, that for somebody who's in a law firm and doing all the things that lawyers do, and all of a sudden that's not your focus? And for the writing that you do, for the involvement in church that you have been a part of for many years now, what did that turning of that corner look like for you?
It was very odd. It was sort of one of those things, like I've written about it before, but I remember my mom saying, like, did something happen? Like that, sort of innocently or something. And it's sort of like, yeah, something very significant happened. And how do you explain it? And, all of my friends and family were just kind of looking on, not in a judgmental way, which is sometimes, what you hear people say, but it was more in a like, sort of way. And it was very disruptive to my legal practice in a sense, because not that I was ever asked to do anything improper, but it's more like, oh, I'm a litigator and my whole job is to fight with people. And all of a sudden I was like, but I just want to tell them about Jesus.
Mm,
So it took an interesting turn, and which ultimately led to me, leaving the law and going into full-time ministry, although now I'm back in the law. So
mm.
it's been a funny path, but let's just say it was very disruptive, and I do not regret it for a single second.
Was the writing something you had always done, or was that a new thing that you kind of discovered at that time where Christ intersected your life?
It was always a thing. I think when I was 6, is when I announced to my family that I would be a writer.
Mm.
I would live on Cape Cod, and I would have 12 children.
Wow.
Which, yeah, I don't
That's
know
setting the
where
bar
that
high.
exactly. I know. And now I think, who has 12 children? That's nuts. I did not. I had one, which is kind of ironic. But so from the time I was 6, I started writing stories. I wrote novels. Like, I remember in 8th grade writing a novel, which, didn't, I'm sure it was terrible. I haven't really looked back at it, but it was some sort of weird science fiction sort of thing. So that's always been a part of my life. And it's something, I mean, the best way to say it is I can't not do it. And I'm always dreaming about stories, like I'll just be walking down the street and be like, oh, what if that guy, blah, 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 blah. So it's just in there.
Everything. Well, see, and I've worked in video production for 30 some odd years, so everything is a narrative. I completely understand.
Yes.
Can you tell me then how it became a part of what you do, that like the little things that I've been reading in my Bible for a couple of years now are these short or medium kind of size things that just have really helped me dial into Scripture. Where did that side of it start to develop for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think when I started working at the church where I worked, I was in a basically a food pantry, although there it was a much bigger sort of setting. But what I discovered is that we had all these volunteers, and we had just undergone some changes. And I realized that as good as the volunteers were, and I would include myself in this because I started in that way, a lot of the serving that we did came from a need to feel appreciated,
Mm,
as opposed to being grounded in the love of Christ and doing it for his sake or doing it for others' sake, from a different place, from a more settled, anchored place than needing something in return. And call it the Holy Spirit. I'm not really sure, but I just felt really moved to start writing devotionals for that context.
mm,
So if you are serving, I mean, people would get so burned out, and it was hard. Just dealing with people a lot is hard.
sure.
And then when you're dealing with people who are struggling in some way, it takes an extra effort to serve them well, to love them well. And I felt like we needed some more grounding. And so that's where the devotionals started. And it just kind of, went from there. But I love scripture from the beginning,
Mm,
of when I became a Christian. And I think that's where I always turned. But I didn't necessarily, because I was new, maybe I didn't really focus on the grander narrative. I was focused on these little stories, like, what does this mean? And what is God saying? And,
mm.
the lawyer in me wanted to ask all these questions. And so I think that's why I've focused on these smaller little sections. And then as I matured, I realized, oh, these small sections are part of this amazing, big, all consuming sort of narrative of God.
Mm.
And that's powerful to
Oh, it
get,
absolutely is. Well, then let me transition to this, because it was picking up this book, Holy Vulnerability,
Mm,
that when I found out that you had written it, it was such a must have for me.
mm,
And it was
thank you.
difficult to read. And that's not to say that I was having an issue comprehending. It's just that I would start at the top of a page and read through and get to the bottom of the page and think, okay, I need to do that again. And constantly, even just in the
Mm,
foreword, and
mm,
it took me forever to get to chapter 1, because it's so much like your other writing that it takes me in, gives me so much pause for thought. What sparked writing this book versus the shorter devotional type things that you had been writing before?
Yeah, what sparked it was I have for probably my whole life had anxiety of some kind or another, and
Mm,
I experience it in my body. And I write about this in the book, but I especially experience it or had for a while flying.
mm,
And, I would fly and I'd have to take some anxiety medication. And I mean, I'm telling you, I would my body would shake and I couldn't
mm.
just think to myself, oh, stop. Or
Right.
even thinking everything's going to be okay. Like that stuff just it didn't overcome the bodily experience I was having.
Mm,
And that was frustrating because it was exhausting every time,
mm,
and I flew a lot for work, and so every time I would fly, it would be like 2 weeks of a lead up of just this experience. And so, you know, as my faith grew, I realized, oh, I wonder if, there's like a bodily response. Is there a spiritual sense to our bodies? And,
mm,
there's a sense in which I'm like, well, of course there is, but there's also such a focus on the intellectual and what you understand and what you know in our kind of Western world that it had just for lots of people, I'd been disembodied in a
mm.
sense. And so one flying experience in particular is what caused me to write the book. There's a guy sitting next to me on a long flight and he had nothing with him. And I was like, what? I mean, this guy's obviously dangerous or something. Like, who doesn't bring something with them on a flight? And here I am with my headphones and my book and my iPad and all the things that I loaded myself up with. And I just kind of got to that place where I was like, is something more going on here? Like, is there a lack of trust? Is there a control
Mm,
issue? And that just kind of then made me dive into this topic of what are our bodies doing and what do they matter and how does God, call us to use them and
hmm.
to steward them.
Yeah. Well, and I love the subtitle, Spiritual Practices for the Broken, Ashamed, Anxious, and Afraid. Uh, and I think that's another reason that it was a little tough for me to read because I kept
Mhm.
finding myself on nearly every page. Some aspect of
Mm.
what you would touch on would just be like, oh man, that's me. That is absolutely me. And if I may frame it within the theme for this month of my shows, the more that I read of this, the more it occurred to me, it's like, these are the kind of things that when we get so focused on these things that hold us back, that keeps us from truly worshiping God because
Mm.
I'm so distracted by something I feel guilty over, something that I'm afraid of, that if the times that I do come to worship, I'm a little bound up, and I
Mm.
truly cannot uh, give myself over to God because I've got so many pre-existing conditions, and I love how concisely that you spoke to each one of those. Any insights you can offer there on how we'll call it the first third of the book came together, because that was what was so captivating for me.
Yeah, I mean, the first third of the book is really about almost like why are we where we are?
Yeah.
What is going on? So we have all these things, you call them pre-existing conditions, which is a great phrase for them. Um, but it's not just that we have them, it's that we do things to cope with them.
Mm,
And the things that we do, strangely enough, are not trying to think our way out of them and apply intellectual thoughts or reasons. The things that we do are physical in a lot of ways. We overeat, or we
mm,
drink, or we shop, or, any number of things are the ways that we're coping with what's going on in our bodies. It's often connected to what's going in our minds, of course.
mm,
And ultimately, I would say connected to what's going on, deeply in our souls and our relationship with God. But if we have these things and we're coping with them in these certain ways, which largely are, like, I think what you said is right, like sort of preventative
yeah. Yeah.
of our worship, because we're so preoccupied with trying not only having them, but then trying to cope with them, then what room is left
Right.
And so, I started thinking about what are the times when, and somebody has talked about this, I can't think of who it was, but like when you're just going along and you're just experiencing joy and there's none of that stuff that's sort of weighing you down. And that is almost like the ideal place of worship because you're being who God made you to be, like
Mm,
someone who's enjoying the world, who's present to the world, who's not being preoccupied by all this stuff. That's in a way or in maybe a definition of worship,
hmm.
that you're being the way God made you to be. And so that's then brought me to, oh, well, are there things that I should be doing? Maybe, I'm
Mm,
looking for a solution
right.
that would help me be like that more often.
Yeah.
So then I just examined, that, and that's what the second half of the book is about. But the first half and first parts is just like, what is happening? Like
Hmm.
why am I doing this, and why am I doing these other things?
Right.
So that examination helps you then figure out what you need or how it might help to engage in the practices later.
Right. And you saying that right there, you talked about awareness.
Mm.
My guest that I had a couple of weeks ago, quite the Bible scholar, way headier about these things than I am or may ever be. But we got into a really good rhythm on that topic of
Mm.
awareness. And there were just ways that he stated it that was like a whole new definition of
Mm.
it. And that's why I
Mm.
really appreciated that you kind of took that first portion of the book in a sense of self-discovery. And that to me goes back to what I was just saying and how I found myself on so many of those pages. And it's like that knowledge that says I can bring anything to God. That's repeated in scripture over and over and over.
Mm.
And yet somehow I've got this strange comfort in holding on to my issues that starts to spill over into so many aspects of life, not the least of which being able to worship unencumbered. Was your hope in that portion to do that kind of a thing for a reader to just, I mean, you drew me in with it. Was that the MO as you began that first part of the book?
Yes and no. I mean, some of it, as you write, is a journey that you're on yourself.
Mm,
So I didn't have it all. I mean, I had like the general structure plan, so to speak, but
mm-hmm,
as you go, it's like, oh, you start to see stuff in yourself. And I mean, there's a good example of that in the book that um, happened to me. I was having lunch with a friend and she was talking about shame, and I was like, oh yeah, I just really don't have shame, which is hilarious now that I think about it. But I was really serious. But of course, unless you're having that conversation or something's prompting you to at least look at it,
mm,
you don't know. I mean, that stuff, it's so insidious and so deeply ingrained in us that it's hard to know what quote unquote, have or don't have.
yeah,
But there are certain things that are pretty ingrained in all of us. And so I did want to help the reader in a non shame based way
right.
recognize that there's stuff in there and that's okay and it's common and it's human and God is present or can be present to us in it.
Right. Well, and I love that you quoted Brene Brown a handful of times in there too, because seeing a talk that she did a few years back on Netflix was one of those light bulb moments for me as well, where there's a part of me, I guess I would have to say that I appreciate that shame and vulnerability are being talked about more often and that we're
Yes,
trying to shine
yes.
a light on those things. But I also kind of have this concern where it's just like pick any number of high tension social talking points, and they become all about, well, yes, we talked about it, but how much are we actually engaging in it and saying, okay, I need to kind of subject myself to a practice of truly dealing with these things, and that's where I have to confess for myself, I am really good at compartmentalizing. I can very
Mhm.
figuratively put stuff in a box and stash it away in storage, but that doesn't mean I've dealt with it. And so I very much appreciate the latter two-thirds of the book and you giving such practical advice on what we can deal with. Either that's, like you said in there, in the now, maybe something you have to put off for the future, I would even go so far as to say something that you could then help a friend through similarly. Um, am I speaking enough about about
Yes.
my love for this book?
Oh, well, I so appreciate it. But I mean, I was looking at this morning at the surrender chapter and just reminding myself,
Mm,
that's where it starts. I mean, you can't really do the other things, or I mean, do them isn't the best, phrase for that, but engage in them and invite God into them and experience God in them unless you have first surrendered yourself. And
yeah.
that's sort of the ultimate act of worship in a sense, is to
Mm,
say, I am yours and I belong to you. And there's a reason. It's because you made me. You are great. You are good. All the things that we would sing. Um, but laying there, in the practice, it's very vulnerable and sort of a weird practice, I
right.
acknowledge, of just kind of laying on the floor. But there's something so vulnerable and peculiar about that, because it's just not our natural, our
Right.
natural sort of protective sense would be to curl up in a ball, then we're safe. So to sort of extend ourselves in that way is such a physical expression of something we'd want to do at a soul level.
Right. And I looked back at that chapter myself this morning, and I have not done that yet, but I kind of just made the mental note of I need to commit some time very soon. And I don't think that there's something
Mhm.
intrinsic to that practice, or that something magical is going to happen to me because I laid down on the floor. But I think that there's absolutely a part of your inner self that is going to
Mhm.
get pinged in that moment, and uh, how disconnected you might feel in a moment like that. But to me, that just seems like such an amazing opportunity to go, okay, it's you, it's me, nothing else matters. And I know that even because of
Exactly.
all my garbage, that you still love me, you still accept me. And my hope is that as I process things like this, that I can find myself going, okay, that's not going to control me anymore. I am not going to be so
Mm.
preoccupied with this tension over here anymore, because if it interferes with my one-way connection with God, then
Mm.
it should never be a priority. There was another line that I wanted to touch on from the book that I thought was so good. And you said, we don't save ourselves, but once we are saved in the most fundamental of ways, Jesus invites us to join him in the larger healing of our brokenness. And it's like, okay, that may have to be framed and put on the wall back here, because I feel like I could read that every day
Mm.
as a reminder that he's waiting. I know he's waiting, and I know he's willing. Who's stopping that intrinsic, deep, uh, amazingly physical and emotional connection with God? That's on me. It's only on me.
Yeah. 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 I mean, that's why I mean, you have to. I don't know. I have to almost, put that top of mind each day,
Mm,
because, we have stuff to do. God put us here and we have work in all the things. We can't spend all of our time engaged at such a deeply soul level, for one reason, because it's exhausting, but
yes.
also, there is something He put us here to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that said, we are far more often in the compartmentalization sort of camp than we are in, oh, you spend too much time on your, connecting with God.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is such a good practice to start with that surrender piece, even if it's not the whole bodily practice, but just sort of in the morning, reminding yourself, gosh, Jesus is there waiting. He's inviting. I mean, those invitations, which I talk about in the first book in Sacred Questions, he's ever like, it's all he is in
Yeah.
some sense. Invitation, invitation, invitation. Come, be with me, walk with me. Let me do this, let me do that. And if we are open to that, it's so much more than being saved. It's part of being, in this incredible redemptive plan that God is carrying out as we talk.
Yes. Well, and you've used the word cope a couple of times here already, and it just seems to me that it's easier for us to come and seek comfort from Jesus, but to take it another step further and another step further of that I've got issues. I've really got issues. And I'm really okay with you comforting me in those. Could we just leave it at that? And that's where I know he's like, but you see, the longer you hold on to those things, the more that there's something standing in the way between you and I. And that's when it gets hard, because you've got to be vulnerable to Jesus himself. Even though he already knows, that's been my thing here of late. Even though he knows everything, I'm scared to tell him stuff.
Right.
And I'm still trying. There's no category for that. So that's, again, where I'm hoping that somebody who sits and reads this book can find those tools to release that stuff.
I was just thinking, I mean, it's sort of an old example, I think, but, just the idea, like if you had this big open wound on your arm, and you went to the doctor, you wouldn't leave it covered up. You would take the bandage off and expose this, even though it was going to hurt, and he might do some prodding in there, but ultimately you would do it because you trusted that what he was seeking was to heal. And it's very similar, we cannot be healed without opening ourselves to the presence of God and the work of God. So if that's what we want, and we do, ultimately, we do, because we sit there when we're coping, we know something's wrong. We know something's off. And I think, the book is intended to not just have these practices as a one-off, but to make them a lifestyle such that you're always learning and growing in being open to healing.
Yeah, that's the word right there. Because I think we can get a mindset of, well, I got saved. Shouldn't everything be good from here moving forward?
Right.
Yeah, but anybody who's been in this for a while will tell you that's snake oil if you think that that's the way that this is going to work. And gaining that understanding that just says, I'm still going to go through some stuff, but Jesus is going to be with me in the stuff. I was just reading something yesterday that was talking about how when Jesus called Peter out of the boat, he didn't stop the storm. The boat is still rocking all over the place, and the waves are spilling over the side.
I hadn't thought of that. That's
that was one of those, how did I not catch that before?
Right.
And that's a marble that will rattle around in there for a little while. But what a beautiful example that Jesus is going to be with you no matter what your storm is. Hang on to that. And maybe that makes it just a click easier for you to open yourself to God and be vulnerable in his face, and understanding that the payoff is all to your benefit.
Now, thanks a lot. Now you're going to have that rattling around in my brain.
All right, see, we shared an experience. You admitted that the most frightening part of your anxiety is that you have a hard time connecting with God when you're in the midst of it. And I think that's where a lot of us live, whether it, whatever category this falls into. Kind of like you can be going about days, weeks of normalcy and then twist your ankle. And now suddenly everyday things seem, okay, I can't even concentrate on that because my ankle hurts so bad. I was just wondering, could you unpack that a little bit more from the anxiety space? And I love how vulnerable you are in talking about what a tough thing flying has been for you. Attach any number of things that somebody else would go, yep, that's mine. How do I learn to get past that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would just say it's really a journey that has taken a long time, and I certainly wouldn't say that I've recovered or been fully transformed by God's power. But I mean, your ankle example is a good one, because whenever you've got something going that's distracting you, it's very hard to worship God. It's very hard to be present because you just want to get out of the pain.
Yeah.
And I think when I'm experiencing anxiety, it's so you become completely tunnel visioned.
Yes.
And you can't
Yes, come on.
have larger perspective. Like you completely lose the perspective. I mean, and flying is such a good example, because I know that it's like safer than, 100 other things I do on a weekly basis. Intellectually, I know that. And yet I'm telling you, when I get in a plane, it's like, well, obviously I'm going to die. I mean, I'm not kidding. It's like
Obviously.
yeah, like I want to tell everybody I love them. And I mean, it's so crazy. And yet that's what fear and anxiety kind of rest on is an unrealistic
Mm,
perspective that is not grounded in God and God's goodness, but is not altogether crazy, right?
right.
Planes do crash.
Mm-hmm.
Like anxiety is not without a basis.
Yes.
It's just out of perspective or whatever.
Right.
So I think, when I get into those positions, my tendency over time has been to just try to talk myself out of it. That doesn't work.
Mm,
And so I think the more I am built up in my faith through physical bodily practices, because then my body starts to go, oh yeah, I can trust God. I can, because it's
mm.
got a mind of its own in this funny sort of way.
Oh, yeah.
And so to ground my body in these ways helps. And then the other thing is just to be able to talk about it and have people. I mean, you can't discount the importance of other people and
Correct.
relying on them to give you perspective. So if I'm alone on a plane flying, I mean, the things that my brain will do are just insane. And then, but if my daughter's there or my husband's there or a friend is there, I'm sort of like popped out of the anxiety induced, tunnel vision.
Right.
And I have suddenly, I mean, even right now as I'm saying it, like this peace or this, I can take a deep breath. Like it's okay, it's gonna be okay.
Mm-hmm.
But you just need people to pull you out of that. And so often, if you look at the ways you cope, my guess is that they're individualized,
Mm,
that they're things you do in secret, or even if not in secret, they're things you do that are very individualistic. And
right.
I would suggest that what you need is perspective, and you need to connect with a broader kind of view of the world and of God. And to do that, I have learned both these kind of regular bodily practices and being with people who can help me and
Right.
to just be okay with that. Like I need some perspective right now. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
weakness or it is and it's okay.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that because when it's somebody, a friend or family member that you really are dialed in with that can recognize that in you and ask you how you're doing and actually want to know and hey, talk to me about that because it just seems like this is worse than yesterday. And you really seem tied up with something. What is it? Um, may, Being a very verbal processor, that's where I go to things, and I'm so glad that I've got some trusted friends that I can basically just go bleh and have them go,
Yeah,
yeah, but
yeah.
where are you getting that?
And sometimes it's okay to process it physically.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not, you don't want to do it destructively.
Right.
So, just as an example, in the midst of an anxiety attack or a panic attack, they often say that, for example, holding ice, if you hold an ice cube in your hand and you sort of go back and forth with the ice cube, there's a physical reaction to that kind of brings your brain out of it. Um,
Interesting.
or playing cards. So if there's something very physical that's going on. You're touching the cards, you're putting them on the table. There's some physical aspects to that. And that is what I would call sort of healthy, coping in the time. And I'm
Sure.
not a psychiatrist or anything, but that has helped me to have a physical thing to cope
Yeah.
so that it doesn't become this tunnel, down into myself.
Yeah, well, and you're sparking another thing there for me in that I was diagnosed with depression a few years ago, and in dealing with my doctor on that, he was looking at different medications, but what he stressed to me was do not stop counseling and do not stop working out. That it was those
Yes.
things that really had very little to do with what a medication might offer because it was very physical. And even just the simple act of walking around the block when your thoughts are so entangled with craziness, how
Mm.
just some fresh air and some movement can give you an entirely different perspective.
And remembering that God made us that. Like the thing is that we are so entrenched in this idea of, sort of the enlightenment period and the intellectualism of our
Mm,
faith that we forget that this isn't a thing, that the body isn't a thing that sort of eventually will be done with. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of this superfluous thing that who knows why God, no, he intentionally made us with bodies, and to fail to engage them is to fail to be human. And so
Mm.
it's no surprise to me that when we have these things that entangle us, whether it's sin, whether it's shame, whether it's anxiety or fear, to engage the body is one of the best ways of returning to being human in God's image.
Right. Well, you've got 6 steps or 6, I don't know what else to call them in the latter 2/3 of the book that are those very practical things. And I want to be very
Right.
respectful of your time and know that we cannot go through all 6. But is there a way for you to kind of uh, boil it down to a couple of basic things that somebody listening right now can get started on? It's like, I know there's a depth to this that I am missing, and I want to at least get my ship pointed in that direction.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, as I look at them, I realize, and honestly, this is the first time at least I'm aware of thinking this, is there's an individual thing, there's an earth thing, and there's a
Mm,
people thing. In other words, there's things that you need to do alone, the surrendering of your body, right? This idea that, okay, I am giving myself to you, God. And when I say myself, I don't mean my mind and my thoughts and my soul, although I also mean that. But what I mean right now is my body.
mm,
And then there's this idea of we're moving into um, being with others
mm,
and being with the earth. Dig in the dirt, laugh out loud. These are things we're doing with our bodies that are engaging with the world around us. I mean, laughing out loud, which is a funny one, ironically, but is like, it's so, it's so spontaneous and it's so life giving. I mean,
yeah.
scientists tell us that, how life giving laughing is. And it's just not taking yourself so seriously, because you
Mm,
could read a book like this and be like, okay,
right.
here's the steps I need to
Yep,
take. And it
we've
feels
got work
very
to do
solemn
now.
and dark. Right. But really it's really trying to bring out the goodness that is around us, and
Mm,
just experiencing it in a way that God has already asked us to. So laughing out loud is one of them. And then being physical with the earth. I mean, it's a really important thing. If you read Genesis 1-2, the earth matters to our
mm,
bodies. Our engagement with the earth really matters. And we've so, again, just in our industrialization and technological world, we are so removed from the earth.
yeah.
And so to reconnect with it, it reconnects us with being human. And then lastly is being with other people. It's, encouraging others in a way that's not being nice.
Mm,
It's being fully committed to their well-being
yeah.
and doing things that enhance that for them. And then eating. I mean, what could be better than eating? And
Right.
eating together with other people is one of the most healing, wonderful, joyful things that you can experience. And it often, I mean, if you think about each of these practices, what they're trying to do is get you out of your narrow perspective and
Mm,
get you into this broader world that God is working in all the time, with people, with food, with the earth, with your body itself, the laughter that you can produce. So all that to say, I think thinking about this stuff in categories, like you've got stuff in yourself, in your own self, that you can practice, that will connect you with God, that will get you to be able to be open to his invitations of
mm,
connection with him. You have these practices that engage the very physical, the earth and your body, that, laughing and digging in the dirt. And then you've got these practices that are communal, that are with others. And each of those, you could pick one and try and see over time. It's not like it's one done.
mhm.
What God will do with those, how He will continue to open you up and heal the stuff that's going on. It's a process, and so there's no quick healing,
Mm,
really. I mean, God can do it, and we know He can, and He has. But for the most part, for most of us, it's a process. And it doesn't have to be solemn and awful. There's something so I'm learning because I am more of a solemn, serious person. And I'm just learning more and more these days as I'm engaging with God in these practices in the earth and running and other things that are more physical. There's such joy. And you can't manufacture it. I'm not saying like go and put on a good face, but the more maybe it's maturity, maybe it's just aging. I don't know, but it's just you realize like, oh, you don't have to take yourself so seriously. And it is work, but when you're walking with Jesus, it should be lighter.
Yes.
He's caring. He's promised to transform you. And our job is to open and allow it. We don't have to tighten our fists and sort of be like, all right, today I'm getting rid of shame, Not that that's a bad goal, but allow God to do what he says and what he promises he's going to do. Like my advice is to know that you're in good company. We're all working it through. It's a long journey, and find some people that know that and can just cheer you on and encourage you and laugh at you even, And yeah, you're on this amazing redemptive journey, and God promises he will do it and he will complete it.
I am making a commitment this year to getting things out of my way when it comes to worshiping God. The stuff that has me distracted or preoccupied. Anything that is keeping me from being fully present in my relationship with Jesus. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "Let us strip off every weight that slows us down." I know that this is a process. I know that I need the voices of people who love and support me. And I know that Jesus wants this more than I do. And I want to lean into that more than anything else. Please check the show notes for links to Kelley's website and her books. I cannot say enough about the book that we talked about, Holy Vulnerability. And if you're looking for a good, thought-provoking devotional, check out Sacred Questions. She has such a gift in her writing, and I believe that it will encourage you. Coming up next week, the Spirit and Truth series continues as we take a look at an aspect of the distribution of worship music by radio.
Air One, we're Dan and Michelle, and we are going to describe our wedding day in 45 seconds. It was June 7th.
We're married to each other.
We are married to each other.
Dan and Michelle, the morning team from Air One Radio, join me to talk about what fuels them to do what they do and how they hope to inspire their listeners to engage with God wherever they go by changing the atmosphere.
I could be going through the worst of days and none of it matters. And if you just were to step back, hindsight's always 20/20, but you look back at your life, oh, God had me here for a reason. He did this. He's right there. And so often we're just not spending that time. And I think that's what worship is kind of forcing us to do.
Make sure that you are subscribed to the Nook on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss any of this series. Thank you for hanging out with me today, and I will catch you here next time in the Nook.
The Nook Podcast is a production of Sozo Digital Media.